Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
My name is John Tong, and I'm a member of Microsoft Research, but I work out of Silicon Valley down here. And I'm joining by the proxy, which is research that we do on social proxies for remote people. And we're very glad to have Professor Jeremy Bailenson from Stanford come to talk with us and visit here at MSR. This is perhaps the first time that a proxy is introducing a real speaker, but it's kind of fitting because Jeremy's research is on virtual realities and the kind of impact of virtual presence. So here we go. This is kind of another aspect of that. I've really enjoyed learning about Jeremy's research in the Virtual Human Interaction Lab at Stanford, both in terms of the impact of virtual experiences on our daily behavior, but also the very clever experimental designs for measuring the impact of that work. And I'm sure Jeremy will describe some of that, as well as some of the ways he's playing with artifacts that in many ways can be enabled with Connect and technologies like Connect. He's written a book called Infinite Reality, which I'm sure he'll mention more information about. But we're really glad to have Jeremy here visiting and sharing what he's been working on and having a chance to meet many of the folks up here in Microsoft. So, and I just want to say I'm going to drop off here because I can tune in remotely through ResNet and get a better view, but I'll probably try to pop in at the end if there's any questions. Okay, thanks very much and welcome, Jeremy.
Thanks, John. So my name is Jeremy, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here. What an honor it is to come talk to you guys about the topic we're talking to today. And you know, just on a personal note, I had a fairly intense week at work where it's the finals week, and I was very fatigued, kind of sick of my own voice. And I've had 4 meetings this morning already, and I just got completely energized by those meetings. I really, the time I spent already here has just actually really made me think about things that I hadn't thought of in a while. So thanks for that, my morning meeting people, and I look forward to the rest of the time that I'm here. So the title of my talk is Infinite Reality, and what I'm going to do, what I decided to do today was to really give you a whirlwind of about 15 years of research, kind of sampling big ideas. To give you a sense of who I am, I got a PhD in cognitive psychology, where I learned how to run experiments about what goes on in the mind. I got a bit disillusioned with the field I was in. I was at Northwestern. I decided to try something new. I got a postdoc at UC Santa Barbara in a lab with Andy Beal. Can you stand up a little bit? This is one of my mentors, one of the best. Go Gauchos. One of the best people I've had the privilege to work with, and learned how to program virtual reality, and also learned how to run social psychology experiments. And so I'm kind of a jack of all trades. What you're going to hear about today is a lot of work that I've done, some of it in collaboration with Andy, who's also the CEO of WorldViz, who brought you this amazing VR experience that you're about to get. Talking about the psychological consequences of spending times in avatars, both good and bad. And everything I'm going to do today is, for the most part, is published. I'm going to rocket you through about 40 or 50 experiments. This is the webpage of my lab. All the stuff is online via PDF. And the big question we're going to explore today is, what are the wonderful and horrific things that can happen psychologically when people spend time inside of avatars? And toward the end, we're going to shift to focus for Microsoft. How can we really think about opportunities for you guys, and what are the research things you can do and the applications you can build. So to give you a bit of a roadmap, I'm going to talk about technology. What is VR? It's a very jargonous term, and lots of people define it in different ways, so we'll talk about the technology. I'm then going to take you through lots and lots of experiments, one at a time. And then I'm going to focus on some very specific applications that we're starting to work on a little bit, that are really going to affect the future. So thanks to WorldViz, I don't have to fully describe what's going on here. So just show of hands, how many of you guys went through the thing next door? Okay, all of you will do that later on. I want to talk a little bit about the technology here. So here is a gentleman who's walking the virtual plank. What's happening here is he's moving in the physical world. as he's moving in the physical world, there are sensors that are detecting, say, the XYZ position of his head, or the pitch, yaw, and roll of how he's moving his neck. And as he's moving in the physical world, there's a three-pronged process. The first is track the movement. Understand if he's translated forward. Understand if he's turned his head. Understand if he's opened his mouth. So that's called tracking physical movements. The second step is called rendering. That is redrawing the virtual world, some digital scene, as a function of that movement. So when I walk a meter forward, we should redraw the world 1 meter backward based on the tracking data. The final step is display. That is updating what somebody sees, what they hear, maybe what they feel. There's even a handful of people in the world changing what you smell as a function of that tracking data. So virtual reality is a cycle of track the physical movement, update a virtual scene as a function of that movement, and send it back to the user's sensory organs. And when this works well, it happens about 100 times a second, and the person has a very seamless experience of walking around a virtual world. And to give you a sense of how hard this is, so some of you have done this, in my lab at Stanford, because the technology has matured, I've been running pit demos like this for about 15 years. It used to be the case that about 1 in 10 people would decide, they'd look and they'd say, no, I'm not going to even take a step forward toward this big hole that's looming in the middle of the floor, which you guys have over there. We're now at the point where 1 in 3 people in my lab will immediately close their eyes and say, take me out of here. It is a fairly compelling simulation that I should stop talking about because you all get to experience it in a second. But anyone who doesn't believe that virtual reality feels real can go next door and jump off of that 30-meter plank, and we'll see if you still believe that. Stanford rebuilt my lab 2 years ago, and I can brag about this because I had absolutely nothing to do with it. Stanford paid for it, and WorldViz built it, but it is the best virtual reality lab in the world right now in terms of a fully immersive experience. We have the vision that you'll experience next door, which is updating what you see as a function of your movement. There's an array of 24 speakers in the wall that can spatialize sound to correspond with your physical movement. So if a virtual object flies by, the sound emanates from that virtual object. And then we do virtual touch in a variety of ways. So this yellow part of the floor is very rigid airplane steel that can carry vibrations. In the 4 corners of the room are what we call butt kickers, which is the product name, that can basically use low frequency sound to make the floor boom and vibrate. We also use commercial devices to move your hands for you. So basically in this lab we integrate what you see, what you hear, and what you feel as a function of your movements. And so one way this talk happened is because John came down to my lab and brought a bunch of folk from Microsoft, and you're all encouraged as well after this talk if you're in the Bay Area. One of the goals of the lab is to give outreach. You're all welcome to come down and do something as amazing as you're seeing there, but also with virtual sound and virtual touch added as well. And here's where I thank you guys. So I've been studying VR for about 15 years, Andy even longer than I, and up until this year, I've never been able to, there's a joke among VR guys, which is next year, VR is going to be in your living room. Okay, and idiots like me have been saying that for 20 years, but now because of you guys, VR is in the living room, right? So what does the Kinect do? The Kinect tracks 20-something points on your body, the XYZ position of them, and it does it at about 30 frames a second. So what you're seeing next door, which is, in my humble opinion, one of the best virtual simulations you will ever get, Andy is pulling that off with the XYZ position of 1 point, and then an accelerometer that gives pitch, yaw, and roll. You guys are giving us 24. So we have the raw materials to have the best amazing virtual experience that could ever happen by tracking your physical movements in just about every living room. A second non-Microsoft technology that has made VR more accessible to the common person is something called auto stereo, which is things like lenticular displays that can give you an amazing 3D experience without even having to wear glasses. So you may have seen the Nintendo 3DS. Lenticular displays are like those fancy postcards, those cheap postcards that can give you a sense of 3D. Lenticular display is a fancy version of that, and in my lab we bought one from a French company called Alioscopy that you almost have to reach out and touch these 3D objects to see if they're real when you walk in the waiting room. It feels as if they're there. So finally, the vision of all VR scientists, which is track my body without me wearing anything, which we can get from the Kinect, and render me 3D stuff without having to have a fancy room, it's here. So VR is simply tracking and rendering. And finally, tracking and rendering are available not for the scientists, not for the Stanford lab, or for the WorldViz people, but for everybody in the country. So, but I don't just build VR. My specialty is social science. I'm a trained cognitive psychologist and social psychologist, and I study virtual people. So when you're a subject who walks in my lab, we want to build your avatar, and we study what happens when you spend time in your avatar. So this is my colleague Jack Loomis. If he were a subject in my lab, and I run 100 subjects a week like this, they walk in, we take 2 pictures of his head and face, and then what we can do is build a 3D model of it. So this is a 3D model of Jack's head that we've done using photogrammetric software, which is software that if you take pictures from a series of angles and find anchor points, you can reconstruct that 3D object in a way that looks real. So how real are these things? They're pretty real. Okay, so if a subject comes in, 15 minutes later, he's wearing a head that captures about 96% of the variance in his faces. These are real enough such that we've worked with the federal government to do police lineups using virtual busts as opposed to photographs of people. I just got an amazing demonstration upstairs of using the Kinect to do something that's very similar to this. So the idea of building an avatar that looks like you don't even need people to do this. You don't even need humans anymore. You can just simply have someone sit in front of the Kinect, move around, and we've now captured your virtual bust. But I want you to pause for a second. I want you to think about what Napster did to the idea of music and how it drastically transformed what we think about music. If I build your virtual bust, it's around forever. It'll never degrade. I can make 1 billion copies of it for free, and I can send it to whoever I want. More importantly, I can change it, I can manipulate it. So this virtual head, this idea of having a human, everything that virtual songs did to the music industry, what does it mean to have a person where you never change, you're going to live forever, and I can make 1 million versions of you? And I want you to keep that in the back of your head as we move on with this talk. It's not enough to make an avatar look like you. We can use computer vision devices like the Kinect to capture somebody's gestures, and this is fairly important. So here's a woman standing in front of a webcam. We're using facial tracking software. These aren't markers on the face. Computer vision algorithms are catching the XY positions of 22 points on the face. And then, so the subject comes in 15 minutes later. He's not only wearing an avatar that has it on his face, but this is the real-time video image. This is me animating, or this is the software company animating the 3D model as a function of the XY position of those 22 points. So if this looks amazing, it's because this is the demo video that the company produced. It doesn't look this good in real time, but it looks pretty good. And using fairly old technology. So you've come as a subject in my lab. We've built an avatar that not only looks like you, but now it gestures just like you. So here's where I pause and I say, well, who cares? And I've been giving talks like this for 15 years now, and I almost don't even need a point to make this point any longer, but I want to focus on, I don't need to talk to you guys about the Kinect, which is the fastest selling product according to Guinness in US history. A Kaiser Family Foundation, my colleague Don Roberts, who just retired from Stanford, every 5 years he does a report for the Kaiser Family Foundation where he studies children in the United States, their use of media. And in 2005, he stood up in front of Congress and he said, children, when they're not in school and they're not sleeping, are consuming about 7 hours of digital media a day. And he said, it simply is not possible, he said this in front of Congress, it is not possible for them to consume any more digital media. It's just not tangibly possible. He redid the study in 2010, national random sample, very rigorously run. In 2010, the child between the ages of 8 and 18 is, if you count multitasking, that is using 2 things at once, they're consuming about 11 hours of media per day. And if you don't, meaning just the pure amount of hours they're exposed to digital media, they're consuming 8 hours of digital media a day. So this is the average child in the United States is consuming, not in class, not sleeping, for 8 hours a day, has a thing on giving her or him digital media. Okay? For minorities, African Americans and Latinos, it's actually higher than that. It's closer to 10 hours. Okay? So kids today eat digital media for a living. 1.25 hours of that are spent in video games wearing avatars. Okay, to put that in perspective, reading is how many hours do you think reading is? Reading print? 38 minutes. Yeah, 38 minutes on average. So twice as much time in avatars as they are reading books. So let me get to the theoretical point of my talk, and this is a big idea that Andy and myself and Jim Blaskovich and Jack Loomis came up with some years ago that certainly was an original idea. Science fiction authors have been talking about this for a while, which is in the physical reality, when I perform an action, whatever I do, you see. Okay? If I smile, you see it. Over Skype, if I smile, you see it. If I lean forward, you see it. But how does virtual reality work? So let's take, have you guys heard of Second Life, this online virtual world? In Second Life, if we were all in Second Life now, we'd have versions of each other's avatars, the 3D models, stored locally on all of our machines. Okay? As I'm talking and gesturing, my computer senses I'm gesturing. How do you do that in Second Life? You hit a button, but let's pretend the Kinect was doing it. The Kinect is capturing my motions. My system is automatically emailing your systems, telling you that I'm gesturing, and you are redrawing my avatar gesturing locally on your machine. So Skype works by capturing pixels and sending those pixels over the network. VR works by categorizing or tracking a behavior locally, sending the semantic definition of that behavior over the network, and you draw me doing what my computer said I was doing locally on your machine. Is that clear? Is that difference between video conference, which sends pixels, and VR, which sends semantic information, which you draw later? That's the crux for the rest of my talk. Okay. So why is this important? This allows for what we call transformed social interaction, which is not, I can send you what I'm doing, or I can send you data, a strategically optimized version of what I want you to think that I'm doing. Moreover, in a crowd like this where there's 50 of you, instead of me sending the same version of myself to each of you, I can strategically optimize myself differentially to all of you, because the way that the Second Life works, the way that Avatar Connect works, is that everybody is simultaneously sending each other their behavior data, and everyone redraws each other's locally. So I can simply change the version of myself simultaneously to all of you. And that may sound abstract and weird, but let me give you a lot of examples. So first, let me talk about how when I transform myself, how I can make myself a better presenter, better teacher, better salesperson, etc. So one of the most powerful ideas in all of nonverbal behavior, which is other than me walking up to you and poking you in the chest, looking at you in the eye is the most powerful nonverbal tool I have. And as humans, we've known this for a long time. As psychologists, we've known it for 50 years, which is when I look at you, your heart beats faster, you retain more information, you're more likely to look back at me, you're more likely to be persuaded what I say. But in the physical world, there's a problem, which is I can look at you guys, but in this room, each of you can only get, on average, my direct eye gaze about 3 or 4% of the conversation. In VR, it's simple for me to send different versions of myself out to all of you such that each of you gets more eye gaze than you could ever get in a face-to-face situation. So the first study that we ran in this area, we wanted to start very simple algorithmically because we wanted to examine the psychological effect. We took 3 subjects. 3 subjects came in. One was the teacher. The other 2 were designated as the students. And unbeknownst to the teacher, as the teacher is teaching the students, there's 2 conditions. Either the students receive the natural eye gaze as rendered via head movements, or, again, we start very simple on the AI side. Each of these 2 people receive the direct eye gaze of the teacher for 100% of the social interaction. Okay? So you either got normal eye gaze, about 50%, or for the entire 20-minute presentation, one person was staring and looking at you for the entire time while we talked. Okay? And so I want you to think about that. This is, in order for us to pull this off, this was maybe 20 lines of Python code. This is not a hard thing to do technologically. We were simply just redirecting the yaw of the head such that it either was being natural according to the tracking data or redirected to stare at both people at the same time. So we've now replicated the study about 3 or 4 times, probably over 600 people in a period of 6 or 7 years. The findings I'm about to give you are very robust. So the first thing we find is that people hate this. Okay? It's extremely uncomfortable. You can imagine that if I was giving this lecture and staring at all of you for the entire time, you would not enjoy that. Okay? But despite the fact that they don't like it, nobody knows that it's not real. So afterward, we have them write a detailed paragraph about the teacher, and no one says, well, it's probably fake gaze redirected by an algorithm. They all feel like they were getting stared at. So despite the fact it was cheap and easy to do this, people are buying into that they're actually getting looked at. The third thing that you get is behavioral change in terms of attention. So if I'm a teacher, I'm a salesperson, half of my goal, half the battle is getting you to pay attention to me. And what we can do in VR, which makes us, gives us a big leg up in terms of other social scientists, we can capture all of your tracking data. So what we can figure out is how often were these guys looking back at the presenter. When I'm using this super gaze algorithm, you guys are returning my eye gaze more often than if I have just my normal power. The fourth thing that we get is social influence, whether in some studies we measure persuasion, in some studies we measure learning. Regardless, if I've got a conversational goal, if I give myself 20 lines of Python code such that all of you are getting stared at the whole time, as a class, you've learned better. As a group of voters, you've decided to vote for me. I can change your mind simply by changing easily the nonverbal factors of my avatar. Next line of studies is based on a line of work by a woman named Tanya Chartrand, which leverages the notion that people love themselves. Okay, so one of the overriding themes of social psychology is that similarity is one of the largest drivers of human behavior out there. And Tanya Chartrand, in the late 90s, she was at NYU. She ran a study where she sent people face-to-face into interviews, and she had the people either mimic nonverbally the gestures of the interviewer. So the interviewer, he closes his legs. The interviewer, she crosses her legs. The interviewer, he leans forward, etc. The people who are being interviewed were trained to nonverbally mimic the interviewer. None of the interviewers consciously detect this, but the odds of you getting the job increase if you employ this mimicry strategy compared to if you don't. And since then, there's probably been 50 studies, 100 studies that replicate this in all sorts of domains. One of my favorites, if a waitress, this is a study done in the Netherlands, if she says to you, ham and eggs, actually repeats the order that you say compared to if she says, thank you, sir, tips go up by about 20%. So we know that mimicry is a huge factor in terms of behavior in the physical world. But how does VR work? VR works in a way that is stunningly easy to do this. I send you my tracking data, you get it from my Kinect, you'd use that to draw me locally on your machine. And you're sending me your tracking data so I can draw you guys locally on my machine. It's trivial. It's 10 lines of code for me to grab the packet that contains your behavioral information, hold on to it, put my name on it, and send it back to you. So think about mimicry. In the physical world, if I'm trying to mimic you, I need to focus cognitive resources. It's really hard for me to do that. I can screw up and you can consciously detect it. Moreover, in a room with 50 people, I can only mimic one of you guys. I can't mimic all of you. With VR, you're just giving me your tracking data. You're handing it to me on a silver platter saying, here's how I'm moving. And so the first study, we start really simple on the algorithmic side. We just decided, you know what? What happens if somebody mimics the pitch, yaw, and roll of your head at a 4-second lag? And the 4-second number didn't happen magically. We did a lot of pre-testing. 4 seconds is kind of this magic land between it's still interactive, but nobody consciously detects it. And what you're about to see is a persuasion study where this woman is trying to persuade this man about a very unpopular policy at Stanford, which is if you're ever caught on campus without your student ID, you're going to get in a lot of trouble. Nobody wants to sign this petition to support this policy. It's fairly Orwellian. And while she's presenting this policy to him, half the subjects get head movements that are normal. The other half get a slow lag of her head movement, so of his own head movement. So let me show you this. So she's telling me about this policy. He's looking at her. So he looks up. 1, 2, 3, 4. She looks up. So basically, she's just a slow mirror of his movements. Okay. So what do we discover in this study? The first thing we discover in this line of work is that nobody consciously detects this. So we thought about half of our subjects were going to be clearly aware that somebody is shamelessly stealing their head movements. But only 1 in 20 people on average, 5% of people put in this simulation, consciously detect that someone has completely stolen their gestures, and those tended to be people that spun in their chairs or did something very unorthodox. And remember, we started with a very uncreative algorithm. It's just a slow mirror. If you put in a tiny bit of logic to make this more impressive, no one consciously detects it. The second thing that you get is attention. So people are more likely to look at the presenter when she's mimicking them than when not, even though they don't consciously detect this. And the third thing that we get is social influence. So later on, the probability when you're out of VR of you signing this petition that nobody wants to sign, which is if you get caught on campus without your ID, you're in trouble, the probability of you signing that increases if you were mimicked by the presenter than if the presenter had normal head movement. So in addition, you're rated as more intelligent, more credible, more attractive. We just love ourselves. And when we see our gestures, on other people, that transfers. And look, imagine what we're getting with the Kinect. We'll return to that later on. Okay. It's not just your actions. So we have a whole line of work about simply grabbing your appearance. So if I were to ask you, you don't have to raise your hands, how many of you have 10 pictures on Facebook of your face, 20 pictures, 100 pictures at a ridiculous resolution of 4,000 by 2,000 pixels? I don't even want to know the answer to that, but I can get all of your faces quite easily. And we wanted to ask a question. I want you to be very impressed by this video. So be impressed because it was made in the year 2003 by a 19-year-old communication major using software that cost $19.95, and it took this student 30 minutes of training to produce this video. So really cheap and easy to do this. All right, I'm going to show you that again. This is the governor, the new governor of California back then, Arnold Schwarzenegger, as he's morphed into Gray Davis. And all this is pixel blending software where you morph from one picture to another. Okay? So it's trivial for me to make my face look as much as I want like yours, and vice versa. What do we know about people looking like you? So again, one of the huge driving forces of social influence is if you look like me. We like to think of humans as this very advanced species where we're deep and we look inside people. And we are, and we do, but it turns out how you look has a huge influence on how I'm going to treat you. I'll focus on these two bottom ones. Davidia demonstrated that if I'm clutching my knee in agony on the street, the odds of you stopping to help me increase if we look alike. And Lisa de Bruin, a researcher in England, she morphed faces and demonstrated that the odds of me handing over my children for you to babysit increase if your face looks more like mine. So we've known for a while that facial similarity has a big driver on people's behavior. But I wanted to ask this in the domain of politics. How big could these effects get? How much would they scale up? And I collaborated with a colleague of mine named Shanto Iyengar, who is a political scientist. And what you're seeing here is pictures of two subjects. This is a woman named Julia who works in my lab. This is a picture of me from 2003. You can see clearly that is from before when I got tenure. Very clean cut. And this is George W. Bush, and this is John Kerry. This is the morph that you saw in that video, which is 60-40 George Bush to me, and 60-40 John Kerry to Julia. As long as you stay under 40%, we've now run over a period of almost a decade, over 1,300 people in these studies, and asked them after the study to write a detailed paragraph of the candidate's face. As long as you stay under 40%, not a single person to date has had any idea that we have taken their own face and blended them with the candidate. So fairly trivial for me to do this. So we wanted to ask the question, if I was a politician and a week before a major election, I took your face and put it into mine, would it change how you voted? And the way that we did this experiment, we 6 months before the 2004 election, which was between George W. Bush and John Kerry, we paid a focus group company to acquire photographs passively of a national random sample of people. So we got about 400 people from across the United States. 6 months before the election, we had photographs of all of them, and we really had a national random sample in terms of age, demographics, you name it, whatever feature we had it. And then feverishly for 6 months, we had Stanford undergraduates morphing faces of the voters into either George Bush or John Kerry. We had three groups of subjects. A week before the 2004 election, remember, this is a very heated election. People either loved George W. Bush or they really didn't love George W. Bush, all right? A week before the election, we asked them who they're going to vote for, and we sent them pictures of Bush and Kerry side by side. There was three conditions. In one condition, they saw the normal pictures of Bush and Kerry. In the second condition, they saw their own face morph with George W. Bush. And in the third condition, they saw their own face morph with John Kerry, with the prediction that perhaps this would change who they're going to vote for based on this subconscious similarity that we've been talking about. What we demonstrated, first look at the gray bars, this is 46-44, Bush over Kerry, which means we had a very good national random sample. We had the exact pattern that you got in the election. In the red bars, when the voter, when he was morphed with George Bush, Bush wins in a landslide by about 15 points. When the voter was morphed with John Kerry, Kerry actually wins by 7 points. Okay, so statistically significant differences. demonstrating that a simple thing like making my face look more like you is going to cause you to vote for me. So as social scientists, we were extremely excited about this. As citizens, we were terrified. And what we immediately did is we took this and we wrote it up and we sent it to the best journal in political science. The editor rejected it without even sending it out for review. He said, voters are rational. Voters don't make decisions based on your face. And in fact, the entire field of political science is founded upon the notion that people make decisions based on substance. So in order to publish this, which took literally 7 or 8 years because of the controversy, we replicated this 4 or 5 different times, huge samples, different elections. This effect just doesn't go away. And I want you to think about it. You know, you're probably a little bit freaked out right now, but I want you to think about all the data you're giving away on Facebook, with the Connect, everywhere. Our digital identities are out there for people to use, and what my studies have demonstrated is that even grabbing a tiny bit, grabbing your face, grabbing some nonverbal data, gives me an advantage to where I'm interacting with you. All right, let's shift. And let's not talk now about me influencing you guys. If we are transforming and changing ourselves, I want to talk about the impact of an avatar that's different from my physical self. How does that affect me? And you know, in Second Life, the online world Second Life, there is the ratio of female avatars to female users is quite high. So you have lots of men who wear female avatars. In games like World of Warcraft, people are even in different species and these crazy goblins, etc. So you have, you guys familiar with the game World of Warcraft? The average player, what do you think his age is? 29 is his average age. Average number of hours per week? Average number of hours a week is around 20. Okay, so you have adults spending half of a work week in these crazy avatars that are different species from us. So this is an issue that we're going to have to confront as a society. And one study that we wanted to answer, one big question, this is a guy named Nick Yee, these are his dissertation studies, is if I spend a lot of time on an avatar that's very different from myself, how does that change the way that I feel about myself, my self-esteem, my psychology, my attitudes? And so I want you to watch this movie. This is the classic mirror demo that you'll see in many VR labs. And this is Nick. He's physically walking around this hotel room. It's a fairly old simulation. And he walks up to the virtual mirror, and you can see he's a white male. In our typical studies, you spend about 2 minutes gesturing in front of the mirror, moving around, and you get a lightning rod. When this thing moves with you in the virtual mirror, it really feels like you. So he's now formed a psychological connection. He was a white male. He pops up, and he's now a woman of color. Okay? And what we ask is, now that he's wearing an avatar that has social features different from him, namely we've changed his race and his gender, how does he proceed to act when he meets someone else in VR? Does he act male or does he act female? And what are the changes long-term to spending time in avatars that are different from you? And the paradigm for most of these studies are, this is the subject in front of the mirror. He looks at himself from the mirror for about 2 minutes. She then turns around and interacts with what we call a confederate. A confederate is another person who's a part of the study in VR with them, whose job it is to talk to them to elicit behavior. And I'm going to summarize about 12 years of research, and I'm going to talk about 2 different identity cues that we change in the mirror: attractiveness and height. We've looked at age, we've looked at race, we've looked at gender, we've looked at having disabilities, we've looked at just about every social feature you can imagine, all of them showing these similar effects, but I'm going to focus on these 2 today. So the first one, attractiveness. In the United States, attractiveness is correlated with extroversion. It's correlated with self-esteem. So again, we like to think of ourselves as this deep race, but it turns out physical attractiveness is a driver of how we feel about ourselves. But in VR, beauty is free. So I challenge you to go into a world like Second Life and try to find an unattractive avatar. It just doesn't exist. In fact, the people that make the software have a hard time even designing these features into the design. So Nick wanted to ask the question, when you're wearing an avatar that's better looking than you or better looking than average, how does that change your behavior? And so in this line of studies, what he did is subjects went up to the virtual mirror and they were wearing avatars that were either 1 standard deviation as determined by coder ratings, or higher than average, or 1 standard deviation lower than average. So subjects went to the virtual mirror, they saw themselves either as better looking than normal or as less attractive than normal. They then turned around and the confederate says, why don't you come on over here? Come on over here. And what we measure is their behavior when they have an attractive face in the mirror or an unattractive face in the mirror. When you have an attractive face and the confederate asks you to come over, you'll step a meter closer to the Confederate than when you have an unattractive face. So personal distance, which is one of the most unchangeable metrics of confidence and social behavior, when I have a good-looking face, I've got the confidence to get right up to you. Okay? We also tape record everything that you say in a subsequent 20-minute conversation, and we mail those tapes off to judges who are trained. They have no idea about what the experiment's about. They're trained to figure out how confident you are based on your voice. And when you have an attractive face in the mirror, even though you're only looking at it for about 2 minutes, and you turn around, you actually speak more socially, more personally, and more confidently. So very large effects. And anything I'm going to talk about today, I'm confident in these data, meaning when Nick had to publish this data, he had to replicate the study 3 or 4 times. These are very, very robust findings. Let me give you another detail here. This work is based on a theory called self-perception, which is I look at myself, and by looking at myself, I figure out how to behave. So why do I dress up for a talk? Because maybe if I'm having a hard time, I can look down and see I'm wearing a fancy shirt tucked in, and that's going to give me confidence to be a good speaker. And that's the idea that my own appearance is changing my own behavior. And that's what Nick wanted to study. There's a competing theory called behavioral confirmation, which is because I'm dressed up, you guys are treating me more official, and I then speak more confidently because there's this behavioral feedback from you guys. And so in order to prevent that second theory, all Confederates always saw the subject in VR as average in attractiveness. So the subject saw himself as high or low. The Confederate saw the subject as average, and what we were measuring is the pure change in behavior based on the belief that you were in a better looking or a worse looking avatar. The next study Nick wanted to do was height. And in this study, in the United States, income is correlated with height, so taller people make more money. A fairly depressing study came out of University of Chicago. They got all the back-end data from online dating websites, and they could do the actuarial math on lots of features as it predicts whether or not you're going to get dates. Basically how many people click to date you. And it turns out that for males, every inch you are under 5'10", to get the same number of dates, you have to make an extra $30,000 per inch. Okay? So you can actually put a price on height. But remember, in VR, height is free. It's just a scaling on the y-axis. It's trivial to make yourself any height that you want. So in Nick's studies, he simply made subjects 10 centimeters taller or 10 centimeters shorter than the Confederate. So the subject walks up to the Confederate, they start talking, and there's a height differential. As with the attractive study, nobody consciously realizes that they're taller or shorter. Later on, we interview these subjects during debriefing. No one has any idea that there's a height differential or attractive differential. This is all subconscious and what we call implicit. So there's a 10 centimeter height differential. They then go and have financial negotiations. We borrowed a paradigm from the business school at Stanford called the ultimatum game, which is a classic money splitting task. And what we had people is actually haggle with real money as they interacted with avatars which were the same height, taller than the Confederate or shorter than the Confederate. When you have an avatar that is 10 centimeters shorter than the Confederate, you are 3 times as likely to lose that negotiation than if your avatar is the same height or equal. So tiny change in a scaling on the y-axis is drastically changing the amount of money that you win. This effect occurs independent of your physical height, so it's purely the virtual manipulation. Even when you take into account the physical height, this occurs, and this has been replicated a number of times. So fairly confident that a small change in how your avatar looks in terms of how tall it is going to change how much money you win. But the question everybody always asked Nick when he was running this work is, fine, that's fine, but I don't spend that much time in VR. How much does it transfer to the world when you're face-to-face? And so for both of these studies, Nick ran the face-to-face analog. With the attractiveness study, you spent 20 minutes in it. You saw yourself in the mirror for 2 minutes as good-looking, and then you turned around, you interacted with a Confederate for 20 minutes. We then take the helmet off, pay you for your time. You sit there, you fill out some forms, and then we walk you 4 flights of stairs down our building, and you're about to leave Stanford, you're going to your car, and a graduate student runs up to you and says, wait, if you fill out this form, I'm trying to finish my dissertation, it takes 5 minutes, I'll give you $10, please help me out, I need you to fill this out. Everybody does it, no one has any idea it's associated with this task, and it's a dating task where you're supposed to choose people that you think would go out with you. So you're supposed to pick people with whom you think you have a shot to date. When you've had a good-looking avatar compared to a bad-looking avatar half an hour earlier in VR, you pick better-looking people that you think would be interested in you. So the confidence that you get in virtual reality extends face-to-face. And again, all of this is replicated, and we're fairly confident that major social consequences from spending 2 minutes in front of the mirror wearing an avatar that's better-looking or worse-looking. With the height differential study, Nick had them spend time in VR taller or shorter. He then took the helmets off the Confederate and the subject. They never saw each other physically. He then put them in chairs designed to make their heights exactly equal and had them then do the negotiation. And literally identical results, meaning the social hierarchy that forms inside VR transfers face to face, and the guy who was shorter in VR still loses money. So, and I could talk about all the other examples if you'd like in the Q&A with the other features, but it's basically the same story for all this stuff, which is a small feature in virtual reality, whether you're good looking, whether you're tall, changes how you behave not only in VR but later on. And we talk about the opposite phenomenon, and this, we call this déjà vu. It feels like I've never been here before. Another word that we use for this is doppelgangers, and this takes the big idea. Remember when I built that 3D model of Jack Loomis, okay? This is a model of his head that looks just like him. But now I want you to think about every animation that's ever been produced in the history of video games. All right? How many is that? Is that closer to 100 or closer to 50,000? It's probably 1 million. I don't even know how many it is. There's a lot of animations. I can take that head and put it on a body such that any animation you can fathom, that head can do. Meaning, we're at a strange point in the time of human history. So let's take a step back and just think about self-reflection and people. Humans have always been able to look at themselves in the mirror. Even when we were cavemen, we could look over the water and see our own reflection. In the last 50 years, we've been able to see ourselves asynchronously, meaning you can watch a video of yourself doing something that you've done, but you're not doing it right now, and you can see this via home video. For the first time ever, as a species, we have a new media event. And this is, this takes a while to wrap your head around, but I think it's one of the most profound things that I've ever encountered in my 20 years of social science history, which is, for the first time ever, we can look in a mirror, see ourselves, and it looks just like us, and our mirror image can all of a sudden do something that we've never done physically. And this experience of seeing yourself from the third person, engaging in a behavior that you either have never done, or you couldn't do, or is dangerous, or is unethical, or is something that you hope to do, is one of the most profound psychological experiences I think that we can even think about as a species. And I want to talk about some of the examples that we've done in my lab. And the first one, this is the dissertation of a woman named Jessie Fox, who really cares about health behavior. So this guy is exercising in place. He's seeing his own avatar. It looks just like him. We've modeled his face from the third person. Every 3 times that his legs cross his waist in the physical world, his avatar loses a pound. So what he's seeing is the real-time consequences of physical behavior on his idealized self. He's getting to see the cause and effect of actions and actually being able to see the virtual self that he wants to be. So he wants to lose weight. We've selected people that want to do that. And what we show them is, over time, an exaggerated sense of the cause and effect of exercise so that they can see the ideal version of themselves and how they want to be. And I'm going to summarize about 15 studies by Jessie Fox. When I give you this simulation, compared to control conditions, for example, seeing someone of the same gender who is not your exact face but looks like you, that doesn't work. Showing you yourself, but it doesn't change as a function of your actions. Compared to those control conditions, this changes your behavior drastically. So all of us in America, Seattle is probably like California, where we're a fairly fit part of the country, but in America we've got a problem where people are not exercising, and all of us know we're supposed to be exercising more than we are, but that's not enough. What VR gives you, and what you'll experience when you go to that pit, I want you to take all the angst when you're looking over this cliff and all that psychological power that you're feeling. Imagine that you're directing this towards improving your own body size or shape based on your behavior. And when you get this simulation, in Jessie studies, we have people keep diaries for the next 24 hours. When you get the simulation compared to control conditions, you'll exercise for an hour longer when you get this compared to other control conditions. That's self-report. She's also run studies where she leaves you in the lab and she says, you know what, your study's done, gives you your money, but if you want, you can kind of hang out here and work out. Here's some weights. And when you give them that simulation, people will exercise for 10 times as long when you've given them this compared to other ones. So we know exercise is a hard behavior to change, and we're getting unique leverage by using these doppelgangers. So on the negative side, or positive side, depending on what you do for a living, Grace Ahn, a PhD student in my lab, took the idea that has been long heralded in science fiction and built it, which is, what if you were walking down a shopping mall and a camera took your picture, and then you got 50 feet later, and then you were starring in a billboard using a product you never used before, and wonderful things were happening to you because you were using that product. There were beautiful people fawning all over you, or you were smiling, and she calls this self-endorsing. So the goal of advertising is, you know, if you can have an endorser that matches the demographic of your target market, who's a better match of your demographic than you? And through a long line of studies, Grace, she just actually published this in the Journal of Advertising, demonstrated that whether you're showing yourself in the third person using a product, or whether you're overtaking someone's avatar and putting labels on their arms about a product, any form of self-endorsing is a more effective advertising strategy than lots and lots of control conditions. A study by Hal Hirschfield, who's now at the business school at NYU. We did this in collaboration with Laura Karstensen, who runs the Center for Longevity at Stanford. And the goal of the Center Longevity is to try to figure out how we can have be happier when we're older. So it's not about extending life, but it's about making sure that you're having a good time when you're older. And in this study, is about retirement savings. So the actuarial math people have demonstrated that people in their 20s are not saving enough money, and that demographic is going to be in big trouble 40, 50 years from now because they're simply not putting money away. Hal was a PhD student of Laura's and said, you know, there's this philosopher called Parfit, and he's got this really cool idea about a connection with your future self, which is we have a hard time imagining future pain. We're more likely to be pleasurable now because we can't make, the pain in the future is very abstract. So what he did is he brought subjects in and we built their avatars, and you can see this a little bit. What we're doing is we're algorithmically aging them. So they go to the mirror and they look in the mirror and they watch themselves turn from 20 years old to how they're going to look when they're 65 in front of the mirror. And what they're getting is a visceral connection with their future self. He then gives them various ways to defer gratification. For example, you can have $20 now, or if you put it in a savings account, you can have more money later. And he looks at the probability that you will defer gratification and put money in savings, and demonstrates that avatars do better than descriptions, better than typical ways of getting people to save money. And just to give you a sense of how this is, how these things are being applied. So a big company called Financial Engines and about 3 different stock companies are putting this as an interface on their software. The woman who did the program in this, Maria Jabin, left my lab and works for LinkedIn. It is now their most popular feature that they've ever put on LinkedIn in terms of getting people to click on a job that was meant for you. And the exercise studies are being used by a variety of different people who are trying to make people healthy. So big, huge opportunities for people that want to do behavior change. Yeah. In terms of where we're doing a lot of work now, we're at 50 minutes now, so I want to wrap up to give you guys questions. But quickly, we're doing a lot of work with energy conservation. So one of the big themes from the work that you're getting thus far is that VR gives you the opportunity to make behaviors that would have been abstract to make them concrete. So take global warming. Carbon molecules are invisible. Their changes are long-term. It's hard to imagine them. And we ran a line of studies to try to connect people in a very visceral manner with the environmental consequences of their actions. So this is a study by Grace Ahn, and there's an article, an op-ed that came out in the New York Times about 5 years ago that said if you use that beautiful, soft, non-recycled toilet paper, over the course of your lifetime, you're sawing down 2 huge, beautiful virgin trees. This doesn't change behavior that much. So Grace brought subjects in. She selected for people that use non-recycled paper. Everybody was given the statistics that if you use non-recycled paper, you're killing 2 trees. Half the subjects read a beautifully written narrative of what it would be like to cut down a tree. The other half put the helmet on, had spatialized sound of birds in the forest, and used a haptic device that shook their hands and were forced to cut down these 2 trees. The trees thunderously crashed, shook the floor, and it's everyone that comes to my lab that does this, it's a fairly profound experience that really makes you think for a long time afterward. What she then does is measure your behavior later on in the physical world. She measures your paper use. When you get this virtual simulation compared to reading a really beautifully written narrative about what it's like to to cut down a tree, you use 20% less paper in the physical world later on. So again, everybody likes to think of themselves as green. We like to say that we're going to, carpool and recycle, but talk is cheap. She's demonstrating large behavioral changes as a function of an embodied experience. We also have a line of work on diversity training. So it's hard to imagine what it's like to be someone from an outgroup, whether that is a different race, different gender. In terms of sexual harassment, I can imagine what it's like to be harassed by my boss, but what if you could put someone in a simulation and have them literally feel like what it would be to be an outgroup? And this is the line of work we're doing with disabilities. So for example, we took a very simple disability, which is, I wouldn't even call it a disability, which is red-green colorblind. Subjects wore a helmet that filtered out so you could either see colors or made it so you couldn't differentiate between red and green. And then they had to do a task that was very difficult to do without seeing colors. So they're wearing a helmet and they're either robbed of the ability to see color or they can have normal vision. Later on, we give them the opportunity to volunteer their time toward people with visual disabilities when they got this simulation, which is being forced to see colorblind compared to having to imagine what it would be like to be colorblind. They're more willing to volunteer their own time to help people with disabilities. So again, small virtual simulation that has a lightning rod to experience that causes big behavioral changes. I'm going to conclude very quickly, talk about 4 different challenges. I'm going to spend about a minute on each one. The first is digital footprints. And so John asked me specifically to talk about some work we're doing with the Kinect, and everything that I've talked about before, what the Kinect does is just make it so we can do it in a way where you have more control of your body and where you can increase the scale because it's in the homes. But there's a side effect of tracking and rendering, which is when I track your motions, I can store it in a data file. And in my book, Infinite Reality, there's a chapter called Digital Footprints that summarizes experiments we're doing with the Kinect and others, which is what can I tell about you based on your digital footprint. So I'll talk, there's about 10 different studies here, but the one I'll talk about is one that I just got data from last week. We used the Microsoft Kinect to track the behavior of 2 people. There was a teacher in the physical world, and there was a student. The teacher's job is to teach the student about environmental principles. The student is listening. Both the teacher and the student are 2 subjects from my classes. We run 150 of these dyads. Okay? For each person, they have a Kinect trained on their body. We're not rendering anything. We're just capturing the XYZ position of all the points the Kinect gives us. Okay? With these 150 dyads, we then take the learners and we can partition them in the top quartile and the bottom quartile. How do we know this? Because after this whole thing ends, we have them take an exam. And we have education scholars that teach us how to grade exams so that we're actually getting inferential learning. And we have a very objective measure of who learned and who didn't. What we then did is machine learning, where we take the nonverbal digital footprint, that is all the data that we dump. The Kinect gives us XYZ position at 24 points, 30 frames a second, and it's a 10-minute conversation. We're running 150 dyads. You can imagine how much data we have. With 90% accuracy based on the nonverbal synchrony between the teacher and the learner, not looking at what was said at all, I can predict whether or not you are in the top or the bottom tier of learning. So simply what your body is doing is telling me what the learning is. And I had a wonderful conversation with Doug this morning about how you guys are thinking about protecting privacy with this data. But to make a long story short, based on the nonverbal footprint, using devices that are much less sophisticated than Kinect, I can predict your gender, I can predict your personality, I can predict your race, for the way that you walk around Second Life, the speed with which you walk and how close you come to objects. I can predict your attitude towards things like women, political parties, whether or not you're going to buy a product. A side consequence of us spending all of this time in VR is you are giving away what we call big data. And if you've got objective truth on things like if you're going to purchase something or not, if you are, so the military is using this to find out what country you're from. And, there's wonderful applications of this, but there's this cartoon from the New Yorker you guys have probably seen. On the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. Right? So the internet gives you this illusion you're anonymous. But based on your nonverbal footprint that I can get from the Kinect, not only do I know you're a dog, I know what kind of dog you are. I've known what you've had for breakfast. It's a side consequence that in terms of things Microsoft can think about, I was very excited to talk to Doug and hear how hard you are thinking about this. But The other thing, I would be very brief on this because I'm running out of time. I want you to take the immersion you're getting with that pit next door that WorldViz has built, and you're looking there and you're afraid to take that step. I want you to port that to imagine that online gambling felt like Vegas. Imagine that pornography felt like you were there, and I want you to think about the future. For better or for worse, when we call these video games, but you guys who have used the Kinect, you know it's not just a game anymore. It feels like you're there. What happens when these things that are already subsuming us feel like you're there? A related point of this is not knowing what's real anymore. And a very brave woman named Catherine Segovia ran a study in my lab where she brought in 100 elementary school children. The elementary school children all got a novel experience, which is they saw their doppelganger. Remember, once I build a version of yourself, I can animate it to do anything. So they saw a version of themselves that looked just like them swimming with whales. A week later, she brought the same 8 and 9-year-olds back and said, hey, have you guys ever been to SeaWorld and swam with whales? And 50% of them not only said yes, they'd been to SeaWorld and swam with a whale, but could tell you about the hot dog they ate earlier, about the different games they played with the whale, the temperature of the water. There's a fairly rigorous method for determining what's called a false memory, and Catherine has demonstrated that seeing your doppelganger do something results in huge formations of false memories. So things for us to think about as these video games get more and more realistic. Multitasking, very briefly, I know you guys are dabbling in this. Have you guys seen the video for Google Glasses? Where a guy is walking and Skyping with his girlfriend while standing on the edge of a building and playing the ukulele at the same time. My colleague Clifford Nass at Stanford ran a line of studies designed to prove to the world how multitaskers get more done than people who don't, because Cliff is he'll be the first to tell you how much he loves multitasking. He published this in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science because the data were so surprising. People that use more than one media at once not only perform poorly in the moment, but tend to be people in general that perform worse at work, at life. What's going to happen as these virtual experiences that we love so much can be integrated with the physical world is something that I'd love for you guys to think about more. Jaron Lanier, who many of you guys know, he's one of the reasons I'm here at this talk today. He really asked WorldViz to come to bring the VR. He and I have been collaborating on something that is only possible now because of the Kinect. So Jaron's big idea. So this is a guy with an arm that's 50 meters long. And this emerged. Jaron will tell you about how he had a sign error or he had an extra zero. So in one of his simulations in the early 80s, when you moved your hands, when you translated your physical hand, your arm was as big as a skyscraper. And to him, this is very inspirational about, well, how can we, what's called remapping degrees of freedom, how can you put someone in a body that's different than their own? And his anecdotal evidence is a lobster. In California, a lobster has 8 arms. Okay? And if you're tracking your physical arms, it's fairly simple how to track arms 1 and 2. It's not so easy to figure out how to track arms 3 through 8. And there's a line of research I have going with Jaron, which is, can you increase people's function? Meaning, can you teach people how to occupy bodies that are drastically different in terms of their physical bodies? And I'll tell you some data that's fresh off the press. Andrea Wan, a woman who works in my lab, ran an experiment using the Kinect and other tracking devices as well, where when you move your physical arms, either your arms move and you move your legs and your legs move, which is reality in an avatar, or she simply swapped tracking and rendering. So when you move your physical arms, your legs go whoop, and when you move your physical legs, your arms move. And what she did is she gave someone a task in VR where they have to pop balloons, and she's measuring how quickly and easily someone adopts to these novel bodies. And we've got some really great data showing that it takes about 2 minutes, and how you can literally, in body configurations, she ran another study where people's, so your arms have much more degree of motion than your legs, and demonstrating, giving someone the ability to have the legs move like arms do, and just showing how you can accommodate. And the answer is really quickly. But that's a brand new area of research. I want to leave time for Q&A, so I will just, have you guys seen this Orville Redenbacher video? So not now, but when you leave this talk, go to YouTube and look up virtual Orville Redenbacher. Orville passes away. Orville is the spokesperson, the most famous spokesperson in all time. He is literally the brand and the brand name of a popcorn company, a very successful company. Orville passes away. His grandson gives ConAgra the right to hire an advertising agency to rebuild a 3D model of him after he passes away from all of that video footage. And there's a commercial where Orville is dancing around with an iPod saying, "This baby's light and fluffy just like my popcorn." And so Orville continues to be a brand endorser from beyond the grave. He's never given permission to do this, right? So you guys may make the conscious decision to have your avatar built. You know, they can do it on the second floor here, and to have it stored so that your great-great-great-great-grandchildren can sit on your lap, and you can have a wonderful experience. They can have a wonderful experience in the future, and that's your decision, and that's fantastic. But Orville didn't give that decision. All right? His data were out there. Somebody built a 3D model, and now he's dancing, or his legacy is dancing around with an iPod like an idiot. Okay? That was old technology. So you watch this video, and it looks very creepy. There's a concert in California called Coachella, which is a very big 3-day big conference. And this is an artist called Tupac Shakur who passed away some time ago. And what you're seeing here is the crowd went ballistic because this is Snoop Dogg on stage. They used Pepper's Ghost, which we talked about earlier, to basically put Tupac on stage with Snoop. No one in the crowd had any idea what this technology was. They just looked up and saw this guy who they all knew was passed away. And, you know, in a very nicely interactive manner, Snoop and Tupac sings a song he's never sang before and integrates it with Snoop Dogg. So, you know, the question is, so this Orville thing is a one-time thing. So with Tupac, his mom gave permission for this to happen. And, you know, how long is it until you guys put him in the Kinect? All right? You know, we could talk about the laws are on this, and that's a different conversation. But there's a lot of big ideas here. And the data we're collecting now, forget about the stuff I talked about early on in my talk, which is, you know, I can be a better teacher, a better persuader. You guys can fall victim to my tools of persuasion. I mean, this is big stuff. Any of you guys that have a Facebook profile with 100 photos of you, the things that the people in this room could do with that in terms of building a perfect version of you is wonderful or scary, depending on your point of view. So again, my book is called Infinite Reality. It gives lots of detailed discussions to all this. If you enjoyed this talk, please do read it. And I look forward to your questions. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I had a question regarding the basic simulation. When you mimic someone, etc. How good do we have to be to stop this belief? I mean, we know, for example, that if you're in the virtual reality test, if the measurement lags by some value, then it disconnects. Mm-hmm. Do we have these kind of measurements?
So since we did this study, there's been about 10 or 15 studies in VR, and we haven't looked at lag in particular, but let me give you some examples of things we have looked at. So we've looked at the mimicry we did was just take head movements. Imagine that you swap the axis. So when you did this, I did this. Okay, so that's making the mimicry more like So it's a fine line between mimicry and interactivity, and what we demonstrated in kind of a psychophysics manner is how the effect gets smaller and smaller as a function as abstracting the technique. But the one thing I will say is that the effects are fairly robust, that a mere approximation. So with VR, you'll see this. I mean, what makes this so amazing is that 60 times a second, no matter where you're looking, they're capturing the position of your head perfectly and rendering it in that position. So with field of view, you're very sensitive. With the behaviors of others, you're a lot more forgiving. Yeah.
I've read your book, which I found very inspiring.
Oh, thank you.
You speak a lot about the narcissistic background here, but you also talk in your book about the potential for education, therapy, phobias, and things like that. I guess I just wanted to ask, with your bed of knowledge, what do you find to be the most promising use of this technology?
Yeah, I hope I didn't come off too cynical. I try to go 50-50 on studies that are positive and negative. I guess I jump up and down a little bit more when they're scary. So thank you for the kind words about the book. To me, the two home run applications in my mind are the environmental stuff. I really think we've got a great potential to connect people in a visceral manner with, what is a carbon molecule? What is warming? We have a study that I didn't talk about that's funded by the Department of Energy. We're trying to get Stanford kids to use less hot water in the shower. They take 40-minute showers, that's scalding hot water. And the simulation is they walk in, we build the avatar that looks just like them. They're in a shower that has a window, and they see themselves through the window. And they've given data about how much coal it takes for 15 seconds of hot water. And in order to power that shower, and this feels really real, it's a really feeling shower, their avatar is forced to eat a chunk of coal. And then we measure their water use, and showing with this vividness you get a decrease fairly. So that's a good one. The education, I think, is, Stanford is taking a very huge, I think, leadership role in doing these online courses. And my take on this, so I wrote an article for the Chronicle of Higher Education, which is my avatar could be a better teacher than I could ever be. And if you take face morphing, mimicry, the augmented gaze, and put them all in a teacher, imagine all of you got the perfect version of me as a teacher. And there's many of you have probably read this book called The Diamond Age by Neil Stephenson. That so we've got a lot of data on the home run applications for education. But no, I sometimes during talks I get carried away. But I do think, especially when I'm talking to you guys that have so much power moving forward to do the right thing, I wanted to focus on the alerting ones. But I appreciate you pointing. I should focus more on what we can do well. Thank you. Yes.
Any studies where the avatar, instead of being visual, is speech?
So, as surprising as it sounds, it's 10 times easier for me to manipulate the features of your face than it is in real time to do your voice. So there's a book called Wired for Speech by Clifford Nass, which is the treatise on doing these things with voice. And there's some studies with it. Just, it's really hard to transform speech in real time. Yeah. Yeah. Sure.
I was curious, with the kind of self-perception stuff you were talking about, is that kind of limited to this fully immersed virtual reality experience, or are you aware that there's the same effects from playing World of Warcraft or something where I'm not literally in the perspective of that?
So one of the most famous studies in self-perception, so there's a line of self-perception face-to-face. One of the most so self-perception states that the world is a complicated place, and there's no blueprint for how I can behave. I often infer how to behave from my own behavior. I know that sounds circular, but a good example of this is if a famous study by a guy named Valens in the 60s, he had people look at Playboy Playmates. While they were looking at Playmates, they had a heart monitor showing their own heart rate. Boop, boop, boop. For half the Playmates, he randomly sped up people's heart rates. For half of them, he had them be the actual heart rate. And then later on, they rated how attractive they thought each of the Playmates were. For people, when somebody saw a Playmate for whom their heart rate had been jacked up, they rated the model as better looking later on, meaning they inferred their own attitude from their own behavior. And there's a whole line of work on that. Nick has done, so one of my favorite studies in regard to this is with Nick Yee. He did a study with World of Warcraft. He somehow got data from 80, 100,000 years of World of Warcraft, and he looked at gender. So a lot of males in World of Warcraft play female avatars, and he somehow got a very large sample size of men with multiple avatars, some that were male, some that were female, and demonstrated that when males wear female bodies in World of Warcraft, 2D, non-immersive, they have a much higher proportion of healing to killing than when they wear male avatars. And there's nothing inherent to the avatar that causes that. It's this self-perception. But I'll send you some of, send me an email and I'll send you some of Nick's work on that. Yes?
How long does the after effect last?
So I get this question every time I give a talk, and I've got two answers to it.
Well, and is it impacted by a positive, like using less water, versus negative, like gambling?
So let me answer the first one first. My first answer to that is that we just haven't done enough work on this. And of the 80 studies I've run in this, I've done longitudinal studies 3 or 4 times. And the exercise lasts at least 24 hours later. I've done studies with obesity where I basically force your avatar to eat Reese's Pieces, and you see your gut grow and your thighs grow. And we've shown some fairly longer term effects with that. But not enough. Now that I have tenure, I got tenure 2 years ago, and social science doesn't really reward the longitudinal study so much, but the world does. But so now I'm going to focus more on the longitudinal stuff. But the second part of that answer is that kids are spending 8 hours a day inside. Right, so as long as you can get them there once a day, I don't think you need to show that it lasts 80 years, right? And that answer is kind of a cop-out to your question. And I think we need the second one on positive versus negative framing. The answer to that is that we've manipulated that variable, how important is positive versus negative feedback, and thus far haven't found many differences. That literature in general is a really complicated one on what works better, fear appeals or positive appeals, and in our work, both have worked. Yeah.
Yeah, so in your the student lecturer example, one of the indirect effects is that the student thinks that the lecturer staring at them is ignoring the other students, which isn't true. And I guess and the question is, will over time we start to not trust anything that's out there, and are we heading to Philip K. Dick land, essentially?
Well, Philip K. Dick inspired a lot of the work that you saw today, whether directly or indirectly. But the interesting idea of this arms race, so I like to talk about spam. You know, spam, there's this arms race between the defenders and the people that create it. And, you know, every once in a while, I'll click on one of those things. You know, they do it smart enough, they put my name in the title, they grep something that, so you're going to have, look, for everything I've talked about with this subconscious persuasion stuff, when you detect it consciously, it backfires. So the mimicry, so we've done some studies where instead of it was 4 seconds, it's only 2 seconds, and you detect it. And when that mimicry becomes mockery, it backfires. And you know, in pilot studies when we were doing the face morphing before we perfected that technique, if you're conscious, and immunologist power, I mean, how I sleep at night by doing this work is that you know, I just make these discoveries and I talk to you guys about it. I don't answer the phone calls from political consultants that want me to go to Ohio and work in those 5 districts and get a room full of monkeys that are doing morphing the same way that they have people stuffing envelopes.
When you see yourself in the billboard, you know what's happened, and it still works, right?
So the way that whenever you want to experiment, you want to avoid what's called demand characteristics, which is, you know what the study's about. So the way she solved that problem is that all the woman who ran this race, she was from Korea, all the products were novel and Korean. And she gave you lots of them. So a month later, when she tested your product preference and recall, you didn't consciously remember the association between yourself and the product. You just had this implicit liking. But you know, it's fairly hitting you over the head. But what she did demonstrate is that you could imagine getting very pissed off at an advertiser for doing this, and she didn't demonstrate that. People weren't that pissed, actually. Yeah.
I'm curious if you've studied the difference in a lot of these things between children and adults. Specifically, like identity cues. Like, are children born with this notion of attractiveness and being more confident when they're attractive, versus do they?
So that's a question that's probably far above my pay grade, the nature versus nurture debate. To answer the specific question, we've only run a couple of studies with children. The universities make that a fairly complicated. And a sad fact of social science is 99% of the work is college sophomores. I mean, send me an email, please, and I'll send you the 3 or 4 scholars I know who are looking at stuff developmentally. What I will tell you is that kids take to VR like fish to water, man. They are, when you see this pit, you're going to be a bit hesitant. Kids are doing cannonballs in there, and they're fairly happy. Yes, sir.
So to kind of build on what the gentleman over here mentioned about the whole Philip K. Dick dynamic, I'm kind of gravitating back towards the children that swam with the whales, and how they kind of had these manufactured memories,
yep,
which kind of touches on the do we, we can remember it for you wholesale.
Yep.
Is there?
Thanks for using the correct name of that and not the movie name.
In your opinion, do you think there is anything positive that can come from manufactured memories that VR creates?
Look, again, I'm a social scientist, not an ethicist, and I appreciate the question, and I'm going to cop out in the answer, which is, in the book we've got a chapter called The Yin and the Yang of this stuff, and I want you to think of avatars in VR the same way you think about uranium. It can heat homes and it can destroy nations, and yeah, if I've got a fairly traumatic event and you can knock it out, what makes these stories so brilliant is that there's an appeal there, right? It's not 1984, them telling me which country I should hate. This is, why wouldn't I, travel somewhere? Why wouldn't I take a virtual vacation? It's cheaper. I don't get germs. I can have all, there's an allure to it. But again, what I can tell you as a scientist is that kids and adults have a hard time differentiate. There's a theory called media richness that really kind of explores, the richer a media event, the more likely you get something called source confusion, which is, if you see something on TV and it's very detailed and it's high def, you're more likely to 5 years later to, basically tell someone else you were there. And it's not because you're being evil, it's just because that's how we are. Yeah.
I worked with Jaron back in the 80s developing the first head-mounted displays. And over time, as they become more high resolution, we found that simulator sickness was a huge problem because there's no gravitational cues. Unless you're on a motion platform, that a lot of people will become ill using these kinds of things. Has there been any solving of that problem?
So did you go next door and try it out yet?
No, but get simulator sickness?
Okay, I suggest you try. You can always close your eyes, in 2 seconds. Nobody knows exactly why simulator sickness happens, and Andy is probably going to be better equipped to answer this than I, because he's more of an expert on perception. But what I can say is, in our time running, we get it a lot less. So one of the reasons you got it before was from lag. Meaning you move physically and it takes a while for the world to catch up. Andy, neither WorldViz nor myself ever run at less than 60 frames a second in each eye. You do get something called the convergence problem, which is when I see an object far away, my eyes focus in a way, and everything in the HMD, even when it looks far, is close. So that hasn't gone away. That's an that's a VR thing. So that could be driving it, but it's a complicated literature on simulator sickness that people don't.
I guess the second question is, I'm doing a lot of research myself with telepresence and autism. We're finding a lot of kids who use telepresence technology can communicate in a much more effective way before and after. Is there any research you're doing?
There's about 4 scholars around the world spending good time on this. I did a project, we got funded by the NIH, a guy named Peter Munday at UC Davis, who's one of the world's expert in treating autism, and we did a grant. So this is a kind of a crazy, so as a teacher, I know that me looking at you guys is one of the cues that I energize my crowd. I pace, I get you guys engaged. We ran a study where, you guys probably remember the augmented cognition call from the late 90s. This is augmented social interaction. Imagine that I received real-time feedback about how much I'm engaging you guys. And the way we ran the study, this was with adults, normal adults. If I'm not looking directly at you, your avatar slowly starts to disappear. So what I get is a real-time cue that's very easy to perceive to give me, as a teacher, an aid to spread my gaze around and to include you in the conversation. And what we've demonstrated is when you give the teacher that simple cue, students learn better, the teacher spreads her gaze better. Peter read this paper and said autistic children who have a very high-functioning autistic children have a very hard time engaging in nonverbal social behavior. What an amazing tool for them. And we've now run 2 pilot studies. He just got a new grant on this as well, showing that when you give high-functioning autistics the ability to get real-time feedback about their nonverbal social behavior, that they improve. So it's a huge area. Ross Picard at MIT does some stuff. Send me an email later on and I'll give you the list of the 4 or 5 scholars doing it. But in general, to take a step back, autistic children are comfortable in VR. This is generalization and it's some opinion, but based on my conversations with Ross Picard, and it's a nice technology to help that population. Yeah.
So perhaps we should make that the last question, but I'd encourage you to check out the demo that's just next door, and Jeremy's around to answer questions for a while. You have a free time before your next meeting at 4. But join me in thanking Jeremy again.
Thanks, John.